It was a regular afternoon when the roar of the motorcycles pierced the quiet town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The town, though small, was peaceful. People knew each other here, waved as they passed by, and went about their daily routines. But on this afternoon, everything seemed to stop for a moment. The sound of engines grew louder and louder, echoing through the empty streets, making heads turn. A group of bikers, their loud motorcycles like thunder in the air, appeared on the main road. Their engines revved, and the wheels screeched on the cracked pavement. They were a regular sight, but today, there was something about them that felt different. The bikers rode like they owned the town, their leather jackets shining in the late afternoon sun. At the edge of the road, there was a rusted old truck. The paint was chipped, the wheels had seen better days, and the bumper was hanging loose. But it was the truck's owner, Jack Taylor, who had a story to tell. Jack wasn't the kind of man to draw attention to himself. He didn't look like much, just another quiet guy with a simple job. But Jack was different from what people thought. The town didn't know much about him, and Jack liked it that way. He worked alone in his small shop, fixing engines, welding broken parts, and tuning up trucks and cars that passed through. His hands were rough from years of hard work. He wore the same faded overalls every day, his hair a little too long, his face often covered with grease. To most, he was just the quiet mechanic, the one you called when something broke down. But if you looked closer, you'd see something different in Jack. His eyes, there was a calmness there, a quiet strength that others might miss. It was the kind of strength that only came from years of facing challenges. It was the kind of strength that came from a past most people could never imagine. Jack wasn't just a truck driver. He wasn't just a guy who fixed engines for a living. Jack Taylor had a secret. A past that no one in the town knew. He had spent years in the army, training as an engineer. He had worked on machines and built bridges in places far from home, under conditions that would break most people. He had seen war, destruction, and loss. But in the quiet of this small town, no one knew that. All they saw was the man who quietly went about his work. But today was different. As the bikers sped past, they slowed down as they came near Jack's truck. There were 5 of them in total, each one wearing a leather jacket with bold patches and tattoos covering their arms. They circled Jack's truck like vultures. Jack didn't flinch. He kept working, his hands steady as he tightened a bolt on the engine of the old truck in front of him. One of the bikers, a tall man with a thick beard, slowed down, eyeing Jack from across the street. He smirked, tapping his helmet and motioning for his friends to stop. The other bikers followed suit, their motorcycles humming as they came to a halt one by one. The tall biker, who seemed to be their leader, walked toward Jack. He was tall, with a rough, intimidating look. His dark sunglasses reflected the fading sunlight as he approached, the sound of his boots hitting the ground steady and loud. "Hey," the biker called, his voice gruff and full of authority. "What's this junk doing here? You blocking the road, old man?" Jack didn't look up. He didn't even respond. He simply tightened the bolt one more time, his movements slow and deliberate. The biker stood there for a moment, watching him. The other bikers gathered around, forming a loose circle, their eyes scanning the area, waiting for something to happen. The leader of the group stepped closer, his shadow falling over Jack like a dark cloud. "I said, what's this junk doing here?" he repeated, his voice louder this time. Jack didn't seem bothered. He worked in silence, ignoring the man. But the bikers weren't used to being ignored. One of the other bikers, a shorter man with tattoos running up and down his arms, stepped forward. "Hey, come on, don't be like that. You don't want trouble, do you?" Still, Jack didn't answer. He finished what he was doing, wiped his hands on a rag, and then slowly stood up. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held something different, something hard, like steel. The biker leader chuckled, clearly frustrated. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna start crying?" Jack finally looked up, his eyes meeting the biker's gaze. He didn't smile, but there was something about his expression that made the leader take a step back, just for a second. Jack didn't say a word, but his silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. "Fine," the leader muttered, shaking his head. "You're lucky today. But don't make us come back here again." With that, the bikers got back on their motorcycles, revving their engines as they prepared to leave. But they didn't know the truth about Jack. They didn't know what he was capable of, or who he really was. As they sped off, Jack went back to his work, his face unreadable. But inside, something was stirring. He had lived through things no one could imagine, and he wasn't about to let a group of bikers disrespect him in his own town. He had a plan. Jack knew that the bikers weren't just passing through. They were here for something. And Jack was going to find out exactly what. They had no idea that they had just crossed paths with a man who had more than just a truck to protect. As the roar of the bikers faded into the distance, Jack remained still. His hands, covered in oil and dirt, rested on the old truck's engine, his fingers brushing against the smooth metal. The tools around him lay scattered, each one carefully placed in its right spot, a habit Jack had developed after years of working in the army. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. He glanced up at the sky, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the trees. The town was quiet again, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He knew the bikers wouldn't just leave him alone. It was the way they'd looked at his truck, the way they had circled it like they were sizing him up. Jack had been around long enough to recognize when trouble was coming. And it was coming fast. Jack's past wasn't something he liked to talk about. He didn't tell anyone that he had been an army engineer for over 15 years, working in some of the most dangerous places in the world. He didn't talk about the time he'd been stationed in Afghanistan, building roads and bridges under constant threat. He didn't tell anyone about the explosions, the firefights, or the missions that had taken him to the edges of life and death. And he certainly didn't tell anyone about the skills he had gained over the years. Skills that had kept him alive, skills that now made him more than just a mechanic. He could fix anything: cars, trucks, even weapons. But Jack had learned something more valuable than just engineering. He'd learned how to stay calm, how to think in the heat of the moment, how to deal with danger without losing control. It was that control that Jack was holding onto now, as he finished tightening the last bolt on the truck. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but he didn't let it show. He knew better than to act on impulse. The bikers had no idea who they were dealing with, but soon they would. Jack took a deep breath and wiped his hands on a rag before stepping out of the shop. He glanced around the yard, taking in the peaceful scene before him. The small shop was tucked away in a corner of the town, far enough from the main road that it was easy to forget. But Jack liked it that way. He didn't want to be noticed. He didn't want anyone asking questions about his past. The bikers were a different story. They didn't care about who Jack was or what he had done. They only cared about what they could take from him. And Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. They would push harder, get bolder. But Jack wouldn't let them. He couldn't. He walked toward the back of the shop, where a large shed stood. The shed was where Jack kept his most important tools, the ones he had carefully collected over the years. He knew how to use every single one of them, but it wasn't just about the tools. It was about what they represented: Jack's skills, his knowledge, and the quiet strength that no one could see. He unlocked the shed and stepped inside, the door creaking as it opened. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves full of tools, spare parts, and engine components. There were blueprints for various machines Jack had designed over the years, and diagrams of things only he could understand. His mind was a vault of secrets, and this shed was where he kept them. Jack went to the back corner of the shed and knelt down beside a wooden crate. The crate was small but heavy, and Jack had hidden it away for a reason. He opened it carefully, revealing a set of blueprints and several metal parts. It was an old, but functional, prototype. Jack had built it himself during his time in the army. It was a machine designed for situations just like this, a tool for survival. Jack stared at it for a moment, his mind running through the calculations, his fingers tracing the lines on the blueprints. The bikers had no idea what they had stirred up. They thought they could intimidate him, make him back down. But they were wrong. Jack wasn't going to back down. The next morning, Jack woke up early, as he always did. The town was still quiet, the streets empty except for a few early risers going about their business. Jack grabbed his coffee and sat on the porch of his small home, watching the world wake up around him. It was a calm morning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had barely finished his coffee when he heard the roar of motorcycles again. This time, it was louder, closer. Jack stood up and looked down the road. Sure enough, the bikers were back. They weren't just passing through this time. They had made up their minds to confront him, to push him further. Jack didn't move. He simply watched as they rode toward his shop, their engines growling like animals. The leader of the group, the one who had spoken to Jack the day before, led the pack. He was the first to pull up in front of Jack's shop. The other bikers followed suit, their motorcycles stopping one by one as they parked in front of the small building. Jack didn't flinch. He stood there, his hands resting by his sides, as they dismounted their bikes. The leader, Dave, walked toward Jack again, his face twisted in a sneer. "You think you can just ignore us, huh?" Dave said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can just sit here in your little shop and pretend we're not here?" Jack didn't answer. He knew that saying anything would just make the situation worse. But he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of them. Dave stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You're gonna regret not showing us respect, old man." Jack's eyes never left Dave's face. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. But he didn't react. He just stood there, waiting. Dave took another step forward, now just a few feet away. "You don't know who you're dealing with. We don't take kindly to people who think they can mess with us." The other bikers stood behind Dave, watching Jack like wolves circling their prey. But Jack didn't move. He just stood still, his face calm, his mind clear. Dave raised his hand, as if he was about to strike Jack. But before he could move, Jack took a step back, his eyes never leaving the biker's face. "I think you've made a mistake," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "And I think it's time for you to leave." For a moment, there was silence. The bikers stood frozen, their eyes narrowing at Jack. They had expected him to back down, to cower in fear. But Jack didn't. He wasn't the same man they had seen the day before. They could sense it now, the power, the quiet authority that Jack carried with him. Dave looked at his friends, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. He had been expecting a fight, but Jack wasn't acting the way he had expected. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time, the bikers began to realize that Jack wasn't just some mechanic. He wasn't just some old man they could push around. Dave took a deep breath and lowered his hand. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, his voice rough. "Well, we'll see about that." With a snap of his fingers, the bikers started moving. Jack knew what was coming. They weren't leaving. They were about to escalate things, make their move. Jack didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what he had to do. The bikers came every week. They were loud, they were obnoxious, and they thought they owned the place. Jack had seen them more than once, revving their engines and making a show of their arrival. To most people in town, the bikers were just troublemakers, the kind of people you avoided unless you had no choice. But Jack wasn't like most people. He didn't avoid them, and he didn't back down. Every time they came by, Jack would watch them from his shop window. His eyes would narrow as they revved their engines, their loud roars disturbing the peace of the town. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't care about their noise. He had seen much worse in his life. But he could feel the tension building each time they passed through. They didn't respect the town. They didn't respect anyone, least of all Jack. They thought they could come and go as they pleased, doing whatever they wanted without any consequences. One afternoon, the sound of motorcycles grew louder. Jack was in the back of the shop, working on a broken engine. His hands moved methodically, tightening screws and adjusting parts, but he could hear them coming. They were getting closer. Sure enough, a few moments later, the familiar roar of their engines filled the air. Jack didn't need to look up to know they had arrived. The vibration from the motorcycles rattled the windows, and Jack could almost feel the dust swirling around his shop. The bikers were here again, making their usual entrance. One by one, the motorcycles pulled up outside Jack's shop. The noise from their engines faded slightly as they stopped, but the sense of chaos that followed was still strong. The bikers dismounted their bikes, taking off their helmets and laughing among themselves. They didn't seem to care that they were interrupting Jack's work. They didn't seem to care that they were disturbing the peace of the quiet town. Jack stood still behind the workbench, his eyes focused on the parts in front of him. He knew what was coming. He had seen it all before. "Hey, old man," one of the bikers shouted, his voice filled with mockery. "Move that junk off the road. It's blocking the view." His laugh echoed through the street, loud and obnoxious, as the group of bikers circled around Jack's truck. Jack didn't move. He didn't even look up. He had been in situations like this before. He had been in worse situations, too. The bikers seemed to think he was just a regular guy, a quiet, old man who wouldn't fight back. But they were wrong. The insults didn't bother Jack. They never had. His years in the army had taught him how to ignore the noise, how to stay focused no matter what was happening around him. He had learned to block out the distractions and concentrate on what mattered. And right now, what mattered was fixing the engine in front of him. But the bikers didn't let up. They were pushing further now. They weren't just shouting insults anymore. They were getting physical. One of them, a tall man with tattoos covering his arms, walked up to Jack's truck and leaned on it, grinning like he owned the place. "You call this junk a truck?" the man sneered, knocking a few tools off the workbench. "This thing's a piece of crap. It doesn't even belong on the road. You should just sell it to us and get out of here." The man laughed again, a deep, mocking sound. Jack didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the work in front of him, ignoring the man's taunts. But inside, something was stirring. The bikers were pushing their luck now. Jack could feel the anger rising inside him, but he kept it under control. He had learned long ago that acting on anger was a mistake. In the army, he had seen what happened when people lost control. But Jack wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to provoke him. They wanted him to react, to lose his temper so they could laugh at him, so they could show everyone that they were the ones in charge. But Jack wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not yet. The leader of the group, the same man who had spoken to Jack last week, walked up to the truck and kicked the side of it. The metal creaked under the force of the kick, and Jack's hand twitched. He wanted to do something. Anything. He could feel the urge to act building inside him, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, Jack took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the truck. He could hear the laughter of the bikers around him, but it felt distant now. Like they were far away, their words just noise. One of the younger bikers, a man with a scar running down his face, walked up to Jack's workbench and knocked over a can of oil. It spilled across the floor, creating a black puddle that spread across the concrete. Jack's fist clenched. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he didn't let it out. Not yet. The bikers were laughing louder now, jeering at Jack as if they were in control. They were testing him, seeing how far they could push him before he snapped. They were underestimating him, and Jack wasn't about to let them win. "You think you're tough, huh?" one of the bikers said, stepping up to Jack with a smirk on his face. "You think you can just sit here and do nothing? You're just an old man. What are you gonna do about it?" Jack stood up slowly, his eyes meeting the bikers. There was no fear in his gaze, no anger. Just a quiet determination. "I don't want any trouble," Jack said, his voice calm. "But I'm not going to let you destroy my property." The biker scoffed, clearly not taking Jack seriously. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops? You think they'll stop us?" Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had a plan, and the bikers didn't even know it yet. They continued to taunt him, pushing his truck, knocking over more tools, and making more mess. But Jack stayed calm. He watched them, his eyes calculating, taking in every move they made. He was waiting for the right moment. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to react. They wanted him to lose his temper, to give them an excuse to hurt him, to show everyone that they were in control. But Jack wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the bikers kicked the side of the truck again, harder this time. The metal groaned, and Jack's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist before he could pull his foot back. The bikers froze. For a moment, there was complete silence. The leader of the group stared at Jack in disbelief, while the rest of the bikers stood still, unsure of what to do next. Jack didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His grip on the biker's wrist was firm, but not painful. It was a warning. "Get off my property," Jack said quietly. "Now." The biker tried to pull his arm away, but Jack's grip was unyielding. The tension in the air was thick, and for the first time, the bikers realized that they might have bitten off more than they could chew. They had underestimated Jack. And that was a mistake they weren't going to get away with. Days passed, and the bikers kept coming. Every week, without fail, they would show up in the same noisy group. The roar of their engines would break the silence of the town, and Jack would be there, working quietly in his shop. No one paid them much attention, and certainly, no one paid Jack any mind. He was just a man who worked alone, repairing engines and fixing up trucks. But while the world saw Jack as just another quiet mechanic, Jack was something more. He had learned how to stay calm, how to blend in. He had spent years in the army, decades, really, and in all that time, he had learned to observe. He had learned to notice the small things that others missed. He knew that everything had a meaning, that every action or detail could tell a story. And that's exactly what Jack was doing now, observing. The bikers, with their loud bikes and rough attitudes, had become his focus. Jack didn't make a move, not yet. He kept his head down and kept working. But inside, he was studying them. His eyes were always alert, always watching. He noticed the small things. Little habits. Odd details. There was Dave, the biggest of the bikers. He was the one who liked to lead the group, the one who seemed to be in charge. Jack noticed that Dave always wore the same pair of leather gloves, no matter the weather. It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a symbol, a sign. Those gloves weren't just for protection. They meant something, and Jack was starting to piece it together. Then there was Ricky, a smaller guy, always wearing a tight leather jacket. Jack had noticed how Ricky would always adjust his jacket when he passed by the bar, as if trying to hide something. Sometimes, Ricky would touch his chest or his side, where the bulge was noticeable, as if trying to keep something concealed. Jack didn't know what it was yet, but he knew that it wasn't something good. Ricky wasn't just hiding his wallet. Jack didn't take chances. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions too quickly. He knew better than to make assumptions. But there was something about the group of bikers that didn't sit right with him. They weren't just troublemakers. They weren't just the loud, disrespectful guys who showed up every week to mess with him and his truck. No, they were up to something more. Something bigger. Jack had seen it before years ago, when he was still in the army. He had dealt with criminals, with dangerous men who hid behind their tough facades. He had seen people act like they were in control, but he knew that there was always more to the story. They might not show it, but Jack could see the signs. And now, looking at the bikers, Jack was starting to see the same signs. He wasn't just a truck mechanic. He wasn't just someone who fixed engines for a living. Jack had built bridges under enemy fire. He had designed machines that saved lives. He had been an army engineer, and his mind was trained to see patterns, to put together pieces of a puzzle. Every day, as he watched the bikers, he started to put the pieces together. They weren't just a bunch of loud guys causing trouble, they were part of something. Something dangerous. But Jack kept his head down. He didn't let his thoughts show. Every day, he worked on the trucks, making sure everything was in perfect condition. He didn't let the bikers see that he was paying attention. They thought he was just a quiet, old man who didn't care. But Jack cared. He cared a lot. And he wasn't going to let this situation go on forever. As the weeks passed, Jack kept watching. He watched how they always parked their bikes in the same spot, blocking the road. He watched how they acted when they thought no one was paying attention. And every time they came by, Jack learned a little more. It wasn't just the way they moved or the way they spoke. It was the way they carried themselves, the way they acted like they owned the place. Jack saw a pattern forming. He could tell that this group of bikers wasn't just some local gang causing trouble. No, there was something more behind their actions. They had an agenda, something they were trying to do. But Jack didn't know what it was yet. He didn't know how to stop them. Not yet. Every night, as the bikers rode off into the distance, Jack stayed in his shop, thinking. He would sit down at his workbench, his hands still covered in grease from the day's repairs. He would stare out the window, his eyes looking down the road where the bikers had just disappeared. There was something about them that gnawed at him, something that made him feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. And then, one day, it did. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Jack saw it for the first time. The bikers had just pulled up, as usual, revving their engines and laughing as they parked. But today was different. Today, something changed. Ricky, the smaller guy with the jacket, was acting strange. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he was checking for someone. His eyes darted back and forth, his hand twitching as if he was nervous. Jack watched carefully. He had learned not to trust his first instinct, but something about Ricky's behavior was different today. It was more than just the usual swagger. Ricky looked over at Jack's truck, his eyes lingering on it for a moment longer than usual. Jack didn't move. He didn't want to give away that he was watching, so he kept his head down, pretending to work. But Jack wasn't fooled. He knew something was going on. Ricky wasn't just nervous, he was hiding something. Jack could feel it in his bones. And when Ricky took a few steps toward the back of the shop, Jack knew it was time. Jack stood up slowly from his workbench, his eyes never leaving Ricky. He moved quietly across the shop, grabbing a wrench from his tool set. It wasn't that he was afraid of the bikers. It was that he was ready. ready for whatever came next. Ricky reached into his jacket, pulling out something that Jack couldn't quite see. It wasn't a weapon, at least, not a gun. But it was something that made Jack's heart race. Something dangerous. Ricky looked around quickly before slipping the object into the back of the truck. Jack's mind started to race. He was sure that he had seen it right. Ricky had placed something in the back of his truck. Something he wasn't supposed to. That was the moment Jack knew he had to act. It was a Friday afternoon when it happened. The town was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded something big. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement and the old buildings. People went about their business, unaware of what was coming. But Jack was ready. He had been ready for days. The bikers came, just like always. The roar of their engines broke the silence as they rode into town, kicking up dust and making their presence known. They didn't care about the townspeople, they didn't care about anything except their own fun. They circled Jack's truck again, revving their engines and laughing, thinking they could get away with anything. But this time, it was different. Jack stood outside his shop, his arms crossed, his eyes focused. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. His heart was steady, his mind clear. The bikers had no idea what they were about to face. Dave, the leader of the group, was the first to step forward. He strutted up to Jack, his boots pounding against the dirt road. A smirk stretched across his face, the same arrogant expression he always wore. He thought this was just another opportunity to taunt Jack, to push him around. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen anymore. "Had enough of us, old man?" Dave taunted, his voice full of mockery. He leaned in, his breath heavy with the smell of beer and cigarettes. "You gonna cry to the sheriff again?" Jack didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Dave directly. Instead, he reached into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The bikers watched him, waiting for him to do something. Maybe they thought he was going to reach for a wrench or a tool, ready for another fight. But Jack wasn't going to fight them the way they thought he would. With a quiet click, Jack pulled out a set of keys and tossed them onto the ground in front of him. The keys landed with a soft clink, and for a moment, there was silence. The bikers stopped, confused, staring at the small metal objects lying on the ground between them. "Pick them up," Jack said, his voice cold, his tone firm. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. But Dave, always the bold one, stepped forward, picked up the keys, and held them in his hand. "What are these for, old man? You think these are gonna save you?" Jack didn't answer right away. He just stood there, watching them. His eyes were like steel, unwavering, and there was a quiet authority in the way he held himself. It wasn't just the truck. It wasn't just the shop. Jack wasn't just some old man who fixed engines. He was something else entirely. When Dave finally spoke again, his voice was less sure. "What is this? You think we're scared of a couple of keys?" But Jack wasn't interested in his taunts. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Dave's. "I think it's time you learned who I really am," Jack said, his voice low but full of power. "And what you've been messing with." The bikers stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to react. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, they could sense something was different. Jack wasn't just some quiet mechanic anymore. He wasn't the person they had been picking on for weeks. There was something beneath the surface, a storm that was about to break. Jack watched them carefully. He saw the confusion in their eyes, the uncertainty that crept into their actions. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to anyone standing up to them like this. Not only standing up, but doing it with such calm confidence. Without another word, Jack turned and walked toward the edge of town, where a hidden gate stood. The bikers followed him, still confused, their eyes flicking between one another. They had no idea what Jack was leading them to, but they weren't about to back down. Jack reached the gate and paused for a moment, turning to look back at the bikers. "You might want to stand back," he said, his voice now carrying an air of authority. "What you're about to see isn't for the faint of heart." Dave stepped forward, his eyebrows raised in challenge. "What are you gonna do, old man? You think we're scared of some old junkyard?" Jack said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward and opened the gate. The bikers hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them. They followed him inside. What they saw next stunned them. Behind the gate was a large, well-hidden workshop. It wasn't just any workshop, it was a massive, state-of-the-art facility, filled with equipment that was far beyond anything they had ever seen. There were machines, tools, and workbenches neatly arranged in rows. But it wasn't just the scale of the place that shocked them. It was the fact that they hadn't known it was there. This workshop, this space, had been hidden from everyone. No one, not even the townspeople, had any idea it existed. Dave's eyes widened as he took it all in. What is this?" he asked, his voice faltering for the first time. Jack didn't answer right away. He simply walked over to a large, covered machine in the corner of the workshop. Slowly, he pulled the tarp away, revealing a massive piece of machinery, a machine that looked like it belonged in a high-tech lab, not a small town like this. The bikers stood frozen, their mouths hanging open. The machine was an intricate piece of engineering, something Jack had designed and built himself. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was the result of years of work, years of experience, and years of training. "I wasn't just a truck driver," Jack said quietly, turning to face the bikers. "I wasn't just some old man who fixed things. I'm an army engineer. I've built bridges under enemy fire. I've designed machines that save lives. And now, I'm going to show you just how much you've underestimated me." The bikers stood in stunned silence. They had no idea what they were dealing with. They had no idea that the man they had been picking on, the quiet mechanic in the small town, had been an engineer with skills far beyond their understanding. Jack stepped forward and gestured to the machine. "This," he said, his voice firm, "is just one of many things I built over the years. And now, you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person." He reached down and flipped a switch. The machine hummed to life, its gears turning and its lights flashing. The bikers took a step back, unsure of what to do. They weren't sure if they should run, if they should fight, or if they should just leave. But Jack didn't give them that choice. With a calmness that only years of experience could bring, Jack stepped up to the bikers and spoke one last time. "I've spent my life building things. But I've also spent my life breaking things. And you're about to learn the hard way why you should never mess with a man who has nothing left to lose." The bikers turned to each other, their bravado slipping away as the weight of Jack's words sank in. They had no idea what they had just walked into. But they were about to find out. The sun had barely begun to dip behind the horizon when the first sirens blared in the distance. But by the time the police arrived, everything had already been set in motion. The bikers, who had once felt invincible, now found themselves caught in a trap they never saw coming. Jack had been waiting for this moment, waiting for them to make the mistake that would finally reveal who he really was and what he was capable of. And when they made that mistake, Jack acted swiftly and decisively. As the bikers tried to regroup, panic set in. They had underestimated Jack for far too long, thinking he was just a quiet, ordinary mechanic. But now, trapped within the very town they had terrorized, they could do nothing but look around in confusion and fear. The first biker, Dave, tried to start his motorcycle and rev it up, hoping to break free, but Jack had already thought of that. He had rigged the machines in the workshop to disable any vehicle that tried to move. The bike sputtered, The engine stuttered, and within seconds, it came to a dead stop. Dave cursed under his breath and tried again, but it was hopeless. Another biker, Ricky, attempted to run, his boots kicking up dust as he sprinted toward the trees. But Jack had anticipated this as well. The hidden machinery he had placed around the area activated, blocking the path in every direction. Ricky ran straight into a net that had been camouflaged in the underbrush, and before he could react, it tightened, pulling him off his feet and trapping him in place. Jack had used every bit of his experience and knowledge to lay the perfect trap. His years as an army engineer had taught him how to think strategically, how to use the environment to his advantage, and how to outsmart even the most persistent of enemies. The bikers, who thought they were invincible, now found themselves at his mercy. One by one, the bikers tried to escape, only to find themselves caught in another of Jack's carefully laid plans. The town that had once seemed so small and insignificant to them was now a maze they couldn't navigate. Jack had turned the very place they had terrorized into their prison. As the last biker, a man named Mike, tried to break free, Jack appeared in front of him, blocking his path. There was no sign of anger or frustration on Jack's face. He wasn't going to waste his energy on the bikers. His eyes were calm, steady, and unwavering, and his voice was firm but without malice. "You've made a mistake," Jack said quietly, his words cutting through the panic that hung in the air. "You thought you could come here and do whatever you wanted. But this town, and its people, aren't as weak as you think." Mike sneered, trying to fight back the fear that was beginning to creep into his mind. "You think you've won," he spat, his voice trembling. "We'll be back. We always come back." Jack didn't flinch. He simply shook his head. "Not this time." Just as Mike tried to lunge at him, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. They weren't far behind, and Jack knew that the bikers' time had run out. There was no more running, no more hiding. They had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and defeated. As the police officers arrived, they quickly took control of the situation. The bikers were handcuffed, their bikes confiscated, and they were led away in silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. The scene spoke for itself. The bikers, who had once terrorized this quiet town, were now at the mercy of the law. And Jack, the quiet man who had been pushed too far, stood tall, his resolve unshaken. The officers approached Jack, their faces filled with respect and disbelief. They had heard rumors about Jack's past, but they hadn't truly understood the depth of his skills until now. One of the officers, a young woman named Sarah, walked up to him and nodded. "You did all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with awe. Jack simply nodded. "I did what had to be done." Sarah glanced at the bikers, now subdued and silent as they were loaded into the police cars. "You saved the town," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't know how we can ever thank you." Jack gave her a small smile, but there was no arrogance in it. No need for gratitude. He had done what was necessary, and that was enough for him. "You don't have to thank me," Jack replied. "This town has given me more than I ever could have asked for. I just returned the favor." As the police took the bikers away, Jack stood in the fading light, watching them disappear into the distance. He didn't need the recognition or the applause. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had protected his home, his town, was more than enough. In the days that followed, the town began to talk. Word spread quickly about the biker gang that had come to town and the quiet mechanic who had brought them down. People were amazed by the calm, calculated way Jack had handled the situation. They marveled at his skills and his ability to think on his feet. But most of all, they were grateful. Jack's shop, once a place that many had overlooked, became a symbol of resilience. People stopped by, not just for repairs, but to shake his hand, to thank him, and to let him know how much they appreciated what he had done for them. The town had always respected Jack, but now, they held him in a new light, a quiet hero who had defended them when no one else could. As for Jack, he didn't need the praise. He went back to his work, fixing engines and machines, just like he always had. But now, there was a new respect in the air when people came to see him. They saw him not just as the old mechanic, but as someone who had faced down danger, someone who had used his skills to protect the very people who had once underestimated him. The bikers, meanwhile, were dealt with swiftly by the law. They faced charges for their intimidation tactics, their vandalism, and their attempts to extort the town. The authorities made it clear that they wouldn't tolerate such behavior, and the bikers were sent away to face the consequences of their actions. But the story didn't end there. Jack's actions had sent a message that echoed through the town and beyond. It wasn't just about standing up to bullies or defending what was right. It was about knowing your worth, understanding your skills, and using them when it mattered most. Jack had spent years honing his abilities, years learning how to fix things, how to build things, and how to survive. And when the time came, he used all of that knowledge and skill to protect the people he cared about. As the weeks passed, life in the town slowly returned to normal. The bikers were gone, their reign of terror ended. The people of the town went about their daily routines, but there was a newfound sense of safety, a feeling that they could trust in the quiet man who had always been there, silently watching over them. And Jack? He kept to himself, just as he always had. But every now and then, when the townspeople walked by his shop, they'd look inside and catch a glimpse of the man who had saved them all. They would remember the day when Jack Taylor had stood up to the bikers, the day when he had protected their town, and they would smile. For Jack, it was just another day's work. Another job well done. But for the people of the town, it was a reminder that even the quietest among them could be a force to be reckoned with. As the last of the bikers were driven away in the police cars, Jack stood still in the middle of the quiet street, watching the dust settle. His heart didn't race. His hands didn't shake. In the silence of the moment, there was only a deep, steady calm within him. He had done what needed to be done. He had protected his town and made sure that those who had terrorized it would face the consequences of their actions. But there was no triumph in his eyes. No smugness, no desire for recognition. Jack didn't need to hear words of praise or see people flock to him with gratitude. He didn't need the town's admiration. What mattered to him was that the people were safe. That was enough. The few townspeople who had witnessed the scene stood around in hushed awe. They couldn't believe it. Jack Taylor, the quiet truck driver who had always kept to himself, was the hero they never expected. It was hard for them to comprehend. How could a man who seemed so ordinary, so quiet, possess the strength to take down a biker gang, to outsmart them at every turn? How could someone who spent his days fixing engines and welding metal have the skills to defeat men who thought they ruled the streets? But that was the thing. They hadn't seen Jack for who he really was. They hadn't understood his worth, his strength, or the depth of his knowledge. They had never known about his past, his time spent as an army engineer, his experience in high-stakes situations, or his quiet but unshakable resolve. They had never thought to ask, never thought to look beneath the surface. And now, as Jack stood there, watching the bikers disappear into the distance, he realized that perhaps this was the moment when everything changed. Maybe now, the town would see him for who he really was, not just the old mechanic, not just the quiet man who fixed things, but a person who had the ability to protect, to defend, and to stand up for what was right. A man who had always known his worth, even when others hadn't. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones you least expect. Jack wasn't a loud, flashy hero. He didn't wear a cape or make grand speeches. He didn't seek the limelight or chase after accolades. Instead, he worked quietly, did his job, and kept his head down. He was the kind of person who took care of things without making a fuss. But when the time came for him to act, when the time came for him to protect what mattered, Jack had stepped up. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. It was easy for people to overlook the quiet ones, the ones who didn't stand out or draw attention. It was easy to dismiss them as unimportant, as ordinary, as people who would never make a difference. But Jack knew better. He had seen the world from a different perspective. He knew that true strength wasn't about being loud or commanding attention. It was about knowing yourself, knowing your skills, and knowing when to use them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to crumble, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching. As the townspeople slowly began to disperse, returning to their homes, their businesses, and their everyday lives, Jack turned and walked back to his workshop. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the town. The cool evening air brushed against his face, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. The day was over. The bikers had been dealt with. The town was safe once again. But Jack wasn't looking for praise or thanks. He didn't need it. What mattered to him was that the town was peaceful. That his neighbors could go about their lives without fear. That was his reward. And as he stepped into his workshop, his hands reaching for the tools he knew so well, Jack realized something. He didn't need the world to know his story. He didn't need anyone to understand his past or his struggles. The only thing that mattered was that, when the moment came, he had done what was necessary. He had used his knowledge, his strength, and his quiet resolve to protect the people he cared about. In the end, that was all that really mattered. And that was the lesson Jack had learned over the years. Life wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. It was about doing the right thing when it counted. It was about finding strength in your own abilities, even if no one else saw them. It was about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, no matter the odds, no matter how quiet or unassuming you might seem. Jack's story was a reminder that we all have something inside of us, something unique, something strong. We all have the power to make a difference. But sometimes, it takes a little while for others to see it. Sometimes, it takes a moment of quiet action to reveal our true strength. And sometimes, the people who underestimate us, the ones who think we're too quiet, too ordinary, too invisible to make an impact, never see it coming. Jack Taylor had proved that. He had shown that no matter how quiet or unassuming a person may seem, they can hold power within them, power that can change everything when it's needed most. So, as the last light of day faded and the stars began to twinkle above, Jack knew that he had done what was right. He had protected his town, his people, and himself. And in that quiet, steady way of his, he had proven that sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who don't have to shout to be heard.